as many of you know, newsrooms are increasingly turning toward visual storytelling, unpacking investigations that might even be data heavy or have seemed really forbidding and not lending themselves to visual storytelling. So we're in the process finding new languages for telling these stories. And here to unpack some of that for us, we have a great variety of voices. This is probably our most numerous panel, maybe next to the Ask Me Anything with funders, I'm not sure. But this is going to be moderated by Pat Aufderheide, who is a great friend of Double Exposure and comes to us from the American University School of Communications. She's the University Professor of Communications at AU, a prolific author, and sort of expert on issues related to sort of public impact documentary filmmaking. She's a founder of the Center for Media and Social Impact and has credentials too numerous to mention here, but I'm going to let Pat take it away and get started.
I can't tell you what an exciting thing it is to be standing next to Diana Schimmel and to be here. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm also fascinated to notice that for the first time ever, possibly, my last name is spelled correctly and my first name is spelled wrong. That never happens. That's how unique this particular occasion is. All right. So could our panelists please join me on the stage, and I'll introduce them. This panel is rather large, and I guess it was just too large for the format here because Lauren Feeney from The Intercept fell off. Lindsay is from the New York Times, from OpDocs, and Zach Toombs is from Newsy. Now we're going to go to Katie Campbell, who's from ProPublica, Cassandra Giraldo, and she's from Vice News, and Amanda Pike from Reveal. But just to start off the conversation, what's a project you recently worked on that you just loved or found like, this is why I'm happy I'm here?
Sure. So I'm a producer for OpDocs at the New York Times, which is our short documentary series for independent filmmakers, both emerging and established. And I'm also a producer in our new opinion video section, which is sort of a much broader section of opinion video where we make our own work that's really just intended to kind of move the needle on an issue. And that can be anything. So this year I did an investigation where I'm a big distance runner myself, and I had a lot of friends that are competitive distance runners, and they're all having children. And then of course our networks extend on to like the pros, female distance runners who are sponsored by shoe companies like Nike, for example. And so we've been watching this year as Nike had been putting athletes into its videos, into its ads, saying, like, really praising them for being able to do it all, for having children and remaining competitive athletes. And I knew for a fact, like, kind of just through whisperings, that female athletes had no protections if they did have babies. Basically, it was standard practice in the industry to pause their contracts, reduce their pay, and they were kind of on their own to come back on as quick a timeline, on really a male timeline as possible. And so I set out to change that. I did an investigation with a bunch of female runners. I mean, there weren't actually a lot who had done this, but they were all under NDAs by their shoe companies. They weren't allowed to talk about this, but I got a few too. And finally I got one of them to go on the record. Her name was Alicia Montano, and she was praised publicly a few years ago for having a baby and racing in the national championships. And so we did that investigation, and then from there we decided, how do we make this more than just a print piece? How do we use video to actually move the needle on this issue and reach not only people in the industry, which is a very small, insular group of people who clearly accept this as status quo, it's all legal, but how do we also reach people like you know, people who may not necessarily care about sports or care about what it takes to, you know, do a marathon after having a baby, for example, or be an Olympian, but maybe you love your, like, every 4 years you really care about the Olympics. And so we decided to actually harness the emotional language of a Nike video, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen, those dream crazy videos that everyone loves, that kind of get to human spirit, for example, and doing amazing things. So we cast one of these Olympians in it, talking about like how she wanted to dream maternity. And it just went absolutely viral, like much more than we expected, because it was really amazing to watch. It was, you were really inspired in the same way, but we also conveyed the stakes and like the challenges that people were dealing with through this same video. And then of course accompanied it with a written text of our investigation. But it went viral, getting, you know, everyone that wouldn't necessarily be the usual suspects to care about it. And from there, we were able to reach the top CEOs of these companies and get them to kind of from the top down, actually change these policies. And in doing so, we were able to present female athletes as almost like the leaders in their industry to change their industry, not only on their behalf, but on behalf of women everywhere. It started a really interesting conversation around pregnancy rights, because again, pregnancy discrimination is legal everywhere in this country. These women are technically contractors, but we just know that it's wrong. And it was really interesting because it actually turned out to be pretty bipartisan. We had Ivanka Trump reaching out and putting on social in favor of these women, and we had obviously a bunch of Democrats reaching out in favor, and it was just a really cool kind of bipartisan way to really make change.
Okay, and no pressure, Lauren.
At The Intercept, I guess a big part of our founding story and a big way in which some of our most impactful stories have come together is through documents, whether those are leaked documents or documents that come from FOIA requests or are found in legal discovery. And as a visual team, obviously, that's not the most exciting thing, and we've thought a lot about how do you make documents interesting. And then more recently, we've been trying to think, well, instead of or in addition to that, how do you kind of do the same thing but for visual evidence as opposed to paper evidence? So we've been really thinking about what sources of visual evidence are out there that, there's police body cam footage, and there's dash cam footage, and there's cell phone video that your sources might have in their pocket, and there's all sorts of things so we've been really trying to think broadly about what kind of video evidence we can be seeking, and we can have our reporters be seeking all the time in whatever stories they're telling. So we talk a lot to our reporters about just always thinking about what kind of video evidence might there be. So the clip that we showed before, the reason why I picked that clip to show and story to talk about is because it was a really good example of this idea that we've been trying to kind of pursue. So that story was a partnership with WNYC about a 40-year-old Mexican immigrant who had a history of schizophrenia and some sort of minor criminality, and he ended up in solitary confinement in a privately run ICE detention center. Solitary confinement, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture considers solitary confinement over 15 days is torture, and for somebody with mental illness, any amount is considered torture. So he was in solitary confinement for 21 days, and on that last day, he commits suicide. The lead reporter on the story, his name is Jose Olivares, he, through public records, was able to get the surveillance footage from a number of different cameras in the room in the solitary unit at Stewart Detention in Georgia, and he also was able to get all these interviews that were recorded by the Georgia's Bureau of Investigation with the nurses and guards and everyone the day after Efron's death. So what we were able to do, our producer Travis edited this, who's in the room here, is sort of put the story together, showing the kind of sped up last 24 hours of his life, narrated through these interviews with the staff that had witnessed this. It's not the most uplifting story, but I thought it was a good example of the kind of work that we're trying to do at The Intercept.
And Zach Toombs, Newsy.
Right.
Does everybody here know what Newsy is?
Well, I'm going to tell you. So we're a little bit less established than the New York Times, for example. And you said we could take this in any direction.
Go.
Should I go? So So Newsy is a national news network, but Newsy Documentaries is a division of the company that's based about 2 blocks from here. So thank you for holding this in the Eaton, by the way. This is great. And we operate a bit like a production company within a newsroom. And so we are right at the intersection of the things that we're talking about today. And we do a variety of documentary and creative news video work. You saw sort of a short reel of that. You saw a lot, so hopefully you're keeping track. But the last clip there I want to talk a bit about, because that's a short documentary that we're actually screening on Saturday for anybody who's interested, called In Dry Water. And that's a great example of our best work that takes powerful human stories and sort of sets those against original reporting, often groundbreaking data journalism that really places these human stories within the bigger picture and also breaks new ground. And so we like playing in a lot of different lanes. We do, just this summer we launched a feature documentary on Amazon Prime. We have an ongoing series with Bellingcat, which you saw a clip of, which is also a really interesting example of visualizing things that traditionally haven't been visualized in journalism. And we're not the only ones doing that kind of visual investigations, open source work. I mean, ProPublica, New York Times have both done a lot of work in that space. But one thing I found to be really interesting in that, and you'll see more about Bellingcat's process if you watch the film on, I think it's on Saturday, Truth in a Post-Truth World, right? But there's a whole process of open source investigative journalism that is fascinating to me, where you can pull in satellite imagery, geolocation, images and video posted to social media and show your work, basically. And so that's something that we're exploring in that series.
Thank you. Yeah, and do go see Bellingcat. It's a really great film. Katie.
Yes.
So everybody knows ProPublica, yes? Or should I? Okay. So
Raise your hand if you don't, because otherwise you're going to think that you do. Okay.
Great. Oh, okay, well, so ProPublica is an investigative nonprofit based in New York, and we do stories across the country that they all have to have some kind of a U.S. angle, so it might be confusing that the clip that I showed you is a story in Liberia, but I'll get back to that. But you may not know that ProPublica about 2 years ago started a video unit, and Nadia Sussman, who's in the audience here, and I were some of the first 2 people that were hired to make up that video unit. And I think ProPublica didn't necessarily have a clear plan for what they wanted to do with us when they hired us. And in the first year, we did everything. We did social first videos, we did explainer videos, we did digital YouTube videos, we did broadcast segments and documentaries, everything across the board. But the film that I showed you, the Unprotected documentary, which is actually directed by Nadia, I was a photographer on it, that was kind of a breakthrough moment for ProPublica, because it was a moment when I think the leadership within our organization saw that the real potential of film to be the vehicle that can make an impact. We are definitely a print chauvinistic organization. And I think that because of that, we have had to struggle against this perception that the most important thing are the words in the print. And there was a 11,000 word magazine story in Time magazine that went along with that documentary. And this was a story of an American nonprofit that built schools in Liberia that were meant to protect young girls from sexual violence, and they ended up doing exactly the opposite of that. And it debuted here at Double Exposure last year, if anybody saw it. But in Liberia, they didn't read the 11,000 word story, which covered a lot more than could ever be in the documentary and had many more scenes and a lot more information, but they watched the film, and that was the thing that actually got people in Liberia out onto the streets and protesting. They were actually carrying signs with the name of the documentary on it, which is incredible. And this led to the leadership within that organization stepping down, and it eventually led to the closing of this charity in the U.S. So this was the moment for our organization when they said, okay, we see that documentaries can have impact, and they recognize that this is a medium that has that kind of visceral and emotional power that is special and kind of unique to film. And since then, we've shifted our focus to focus more exclusively on long-form documentaries.
And how long was Unprotected?
It was about 45 minutes.
Okay, great. And Cassandra?
Hi. So for those that aren't familiar with Vice News Tonight, we're a 30-minute nightly newscast. And I think we're most known for our special report on Charlottesville. And I was really excited to be invited to this panel because, Vice News Tonight to me is the epitome of a visual newsroom. And I want to go back for a second and explain I was one of the first hires at the inception of our show 3 years ago, when we were just we were figuring out how nightly newscast can look differently. And part of how to create that was in the hiring. And so speaking in my own personal background, and thinking back to one of the questions I think was making a shift in careers from print to video per se. My background is in photojournalism. I have shot video in the past, but previous to Vice News Tonight, I had no experience in television, and I was a still photographer. And so I was kind of plucked out of obscurity from being a lone wolf photographer in New York City, shooting for newspapers, but having a huge interest in kind of making the leap into filmmaking and documentary. I was also happened to be a part-time student in the investigative program at Columbia when they were building this team for our new show. And I think the newsroom, the makeup of the newsroom since the beginning has been sort of this hodgepodge of filmmakers, journalists, DPs, photographers like myself, different backgrounds, and was very intentional in terms of injecting a purely visual experience. And so, again, just to kind of explain our show for those who haven't seen it, it's on a typical night it's a variety of things. It's, we have a whole graphics team, so our show, opens with a series of graphics packages, and then we just have kind of like a series of both long-form and short-term news and desk reports that are more kind of in the traditional flavor of television news. And so I give that context because I think for visuals are, for me, like run supreme, and it's been a great education to be in a newsroom that also prioritizes that and allows for a lot of collaboration. I wouldn't have become the TV producer I am without having these 3 years experience on this program. And so the clip that I decided to show today, again, is kind of not the typical nightly show. Every so often we will have special reports. And by the way, this one, it was pretty sensitive. I should have mentioned before we screened the clip. But this was a project that I produced just this past year that was a full episode about mental health, the mental health of children in Florida. And that is sort of an example of how story kind of runs supreme in our newsroom. The fact that I was able to, this is a story that I pitched well over a year ago through my own research. When I kind of hop at some of the questions that were in the crowd, it was around in the aftermath of the Parkland shootings, while some of my colleagues, again, to bring up sort of the eccentricities of my newsroom, we have the demands of a nightly newsroom, so we're like always responding to deadlines. So in this case, I had my colleagues who, as they should have been responding to what was going on the ground. Meanwhile, I kind of took it upon myself to really examine some of the discussions that were circulating around mental health of kids. And the term Baker Act had floated in one of the press reports, and I took it upon myself because I'm a huge research nerd. As much as I'm a huge image nerd and a photographer to the core, I love research and I love reporting, and I zeroed in on this phrase, Baker Act. And that led to my own personal investigation for a year into what this system looks like in Florida. And it is essentially, it's a 50-year-long process in which both children and adults can be psychiatrically held for 72 hours. And it was a policy that was being referred to in the aftermath of the shooting as a sort of stopgap to prevent things like this. And I just thought there was more to the story, and kind of in the same curiosity as I approach things as a photographer, I had kind of become obsessed with this, and and thankfully had the support of my newsroom, who kind of gave me the slack to, in addition to my responsibilities to my daily turnarounds, I was plugging away at this for a year, talking to families on the phone, before then going out into the field. And so I can go on to the specifics of it later, but that for me, this experience was, as sort of a photojournalist turned TV producer, kind of the epitome of how hybridity in the newsroom can be really wonderful, and that collaboration is so important, and appreciation for different backgrounds in journalism and filmmaking can be really wonderful. So yeah, I'm gonna cut myself off.
And Amanda.
So I work at the Center for Investigative Reporting. Just to give a quick intro to us, we are the oldest investigative nonprofit in the country. We've been around 40 years, probably have the longest name too now that we're revealed from the Center for Investigative Reporting. In addition to being a visual newsroom, we do multi-platform. So we have a weekly investigative radio show called Reveal that's on 500 NPR stations. We do text pieces that appear on with a lot of partners like the Associated Press. And then I run the TV and doc department. So our biggest investigations, we do multi-platform. And I was thinking about your question, and instead of having one project that came to mind, and I should say it's like the opposite of Vice News, where we do not cover breaking news. We only do long-form, deep dive investigations that take 6 months to a year or sometimes longer. So what I'm excited about and what's been interesting for us is the ability we've been able to do a lot of different kinds of content. So we have sort of 3 buckets of content. One is that we do quicker turn stories that, will take a few months. And we work with partners like the PBS NewsHour. It's been a great partnership for us, where we'll do an 8 to 9 minute piece for their newscast, and that's a good way to get several different stories out a year of our investigations. And we also found that, like Katie, sometimes we'd have a text piece come out that can be 10,000 words, but then what really got people was this 8-minute piece, and especially the NewsHour, their audience has been a great driver of impact for us, so that's been great. We also do, as you saw, these animations where sometimes in that particular story we were covering sort of a black box where our cameras couldn't go. So we used voices from the field and animated that story. And then we're also now focusing more on longer form documentary features and series. So the first clip was a documentary in progress that we're partnering with Gabriella Cowperthwaite, who directed Blackfish, about a documentary about food and water issues around the world. So it's really been a broad range of stories, but one thing that and we have a very small video team. There are 4 of us, so everyone wears a different hat. There's a shooter, producer, editor, producer. Everyone has to pitch in different ways. But a way that we've been able to expand what we do and expand our work is really through collaboration. So whether it's working with the NewsHour, and that's where our program is appearing, or working with outside directors to come in and really work with them to bring a more cinematic perspective to our storytelling. And then we're in the process of, we have several longer documentary series in the works. So one is going to come out next year that's based on about 5 years of one of our investigations. So, and that's something that we partnered with an outside production company, and then is going to, appear on a cable piece. So we don't. It's whatever. What does the story dictate? What's the best way of telling it, and who can help us get it out there?
Well, one of the things that really strikes me is the diversity of what you guys are up to. Well, it's all deeply infused with journalism. Can I just start from the other end, which means you're going to go right to work, Amanda? I offer another provocation here, which is just to think in terms of like one or two sentences. What's a really big challenge? What's a headache, a challenge? Something that for visual journalism and the job that you're doing, what's hard?
So many things, so many challenges. We also have the problem, like the intercept, of sometimes we don't start from the most visual place documents, trying to get away from just shots of guilty buildings. But,
helicopter shots of Manhattan.
Thank God for the drone, yeah. But one of the biggest challenge that came to my mind, and I'll try to keep it short, was from the animated piece that you saw, and it was really the reporter's journey. That story was reported by Aura Bogado, who is one of our lead immigration reporter, and that story came from a tip that she got a shaky cell phone video that this woman sent of a group of kids in matching sweatsuits being shuffled into a building. And it was such an interesting process of how she reported that, even aside from the visual storytelling, where she had to get property records. Who owns the building? It was MVM, one of the largest transporters of migrant children. Then she had to go get federal records and sources to find out who the kids were being held in that building. And then she found out that MVM employees were actually the ones physically separating children from their parents at ICE facilities. Then when she got the names of the kids, she had to find the parents of the children, and she had volunteers fan out at all these different cities to let people know that she wanted to talk with them. Some of the parents were even incarcerated, or at the time being held themselves. Then she had to gain the trust of the parents in order to tell their story. And then she additionally had the issue of talking with the then 7-year-old boy who was held in one of those office buildings, to get him to, open up about his traumatic experience. And she actually always, I guess is a common thing for her when she interviews young children, she has them draw pictures of their experiences. And that was the way that Wilson, the child in that, really opened up to her. And then the pictures that he drew actually became a part of the animation and a part of that process. So that's the story that comes to mind of challenges of how that one tip sort of launched an entire investigation. And multiplayer, it was on the radio, it was a text piece, it was an animation, it was a news hour.
Oh, wow. One of the things that you're talking about is so interesting to me, that each of these projects has multiple iterations in different formats. Cassandra?
Yeah, I guess maybe they're a bit more personal in terms of like navigating a nightly newsroom and the challenges therein, especially one that's like a new frontier, had been a new frontier, and we were figuring it out as we're going along. So one would be just striking that balance between the nightly news demand and your sort of passion projects, your interest in getting deeper and doing your long form projects. So I worked on the project on mental health in Florida for a little over a year, and a lot of my colleagues didn't even realize I was working on it, and they were very surprised when it aired that I had been working on it behind the scenes, because I was also producing for our nightly news show, short, 6-7 minute segments. And so that boundary therein for all of us, just as producers in a newsroom, and making sure to, take care of yourself, but also to follow. I think a lot of my colleagues ask me how how I was able to do it. And I think a lot of people get very daunted by this idea of long form, that it requires all these special things. But really, it's just reporting and like being obsessive. And so I was obsessive enough that I took the time in between my commitments, and maybe at the sacrifice of my mental health as well. But so anyways, secondarily, I think especially as a younger producer within a new kind of newsroom, is navigating, knowing when to ask for help and appreciating collaboration. I think maybe this also comes back to my background as a photojournalist and always either working alone or being a sidekick to a reporter, and then suddenly having a whole newsroom at my exposure, and also making short films for news and documentaries, and realizing the great power of like being able to collaborate. And I, especially for this project, while I produced it mostly by myself, everyone within my newsroom had touched it in some way to make it what it was, and that's so valuable. You never want to feel alone. So those are my two.
So I've got two things. One is when to plug in. When we have a print newsroom of many reporters and there's just a few of us making documentaries, these investigations can go on for months and months and months, and we don't necessarily know at the start, like, is this really going to pay off, and is it going to be the investigation we imagine? But if we don't dive in at that point, we may miss some really important visual moments if we aren't filming early. So that's an ongoing challenge that we continually have to negotiate. And I think also, when the relationships with the sources have been built by the print reporters, they don't necessarily know how to kind of ask for the access that we need as visual journalists to be able to talk them into being on camera, or talk through the process even. I shouldn't even say talk them into being on camera, but discuss the process of being on camera. To be able to be the person who has that relationship with the source, and having to go through another person, that has been a challenge that we've had. And then finally, source fatigue. When you're trying to do so many different types of mediums, stories if we're doing it for radio and for print and for video, you're asking people to be, you're needling around in some really painful memories and history oftentimes, and if you're then asking them to do it again and on camera, that becomes a big challenge, I think. So.
Just two quick things. I mean, one kind of logistical, but striking that balance between experimentation and distribution and format with just the demands of being part of a news company, and being part of a company in general. We're always looking for ways to reach new audiences and new revenue streams, which doesn't sound like very artful and fun, but is important. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention was just figuring out the best way to tell a story, because there are so many different avenues that you can go down in this field, of course, and the feature that I mentioned, Blowout, could have been told a lot of different ways. It was a partnership with the Associated Press, the Texas Tribune, and the Center for Public Integrity, and Newsy. And it could have been a very technical story. It could have been told purely through sort of an explainer format. It could have been a much more sort of personal, intimate story with a smaller scope. But ultimately, we thought that this was a good candidate to tell a bigger, broader scoped story. And so figuring out what would be the narrative arc and backbone, that was probably the biggest challenge there. And ultimately, it was just following the physical path of American fossil fuel. That provided its own sort of narrative arc for the story.
Thank you. Lauren.
So a struggle that I've been thinking a lot about, particularly in this past week, is, but really since the beginning of the Trump administration, is, how do you keep your focus on deeper investigative stories about important issues in the midst of a news cycle where you're getting like 10 ground-shaking pop-ups on your phone a day? Like the news cycle is just relentless, and how do you find a window of time where you can get people to care about these really important stories that don't necessarily have to do with the president?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely echo everything that everyone else said up here today. But I think for me, an interesting like intellectual and creative exercise has been like when you get this information, like when you figure out like when you get some sort of fact or revelation or something, like what do you do with it? Like how do you spin that story to turn it into like the so what, or like to find the antagonist? Like again, we're thinking all the time right now about impact and like how do we change something? And I think sometimes the hardest part there is actually thinking about what the actual thing is that you want to change in a narrow way. Like a lot of these problems that a lot of us are dealing with right now, and even what you just mentioned, they're structural. You can't just kind of air an issue and expect that it will change. You have to actually find some antagonist and really figure out how to poke at that antagonist and actually get that antagonist to flip. And I think that's what I've been thinking about so much right now. Like someone just came to me with this, it's adjacent to the news, and it's a fairly well-known person that's like connected to the story. So I have this exclusive of her story, and it's really sad, and like you guys will see it and you'll all talk about it. But I'm trying to think like, how do I take this story and turn it so that it actually changes something? And I think that's the real intellectual and creative challenge that all of us here face.
Wow. Well, that's a great set of challenges. What I know is how important are independent filmmakers, freelancers in your project, and about how much could they expect to get if they worked with you, if that makes sense.
For UpDocs, they're essential. It's really a forum, I hope a really desirable forum for an independent filmmaker to contribute to. So literally everyone in this room could send me a pitch, and I would hope that some of them would make it through and get highlighted on our platform. If you do, we pay upon publication. You were asking about money, right? It's usually a small stipend of like $3,000 or $4,000. We don't have a ton of money, but what we do offer is ideally platform audience and that production experience that will hopefully get you the impact you're looking for.
Lauren?
We also rely very much on independent filmmakers. Our video team was 2 people until yesterday when we got our 3rd. So most of what we do is with freelancers, and we're excited for your pitches. And in terms of money, we really do try and pay people for their work. We think that's really important. We'll have you put together a reasonable budget, and we'll try and do what we can, and sometimes if we can't, then we will try and partner or try and find grants and try and actually pay you for your work.
Zach?
And actually, in contrast, most of our work is done in-house, so we don't work with freelance producers and journalists and filmmakers as often, but they can be a very important part of certain stories, and we're also, we bring in freelance producers often as part of our own crew.
Contract.
Sorry?
You contract with them for
Yes, yeah. And similar to what you were saying, if we don't have the budget resources to achieve a pitch that's brought to us, we'll go out and we'll partner or find other sources as well. So most of it's in-house, but we remain open to opportunities from freelancers.
Great. Katie?
It's pretty similar at ProPublica. Most of the work is done in-house. We will hire freelance photographers or editors once in a while for contract projects if we need extra help with our projects. But in terms of like independent filmmakers bringing their own ideas to ProPublica, that doesn't happen so much. Sometimes there's independent reporters that will do work for ProPublica, and that's actually where the original idea for the documentary came from. Was the reporting was done by a freelance reporter, so it's possible, but there's not much.
Thanks for saying that, Katie. I should have asked about independent filmmakers and journalists. Yes. Reporters.
For Vice News Tonight, I'd say, again, primarily producing is all in-house. In terms of freelancing, we often freelance a lot of our DPs, so I'll shoot alongside some freelance DPs along with our staff. But I think that's changing probably going to change as our newsroom is expanding, and I know we're actually hiring more staff. So keep an eye out for field producer gigs in particular. One of the nice things is that, particularly for a field producer role, is that for folks like myself that have a shooting background, it's a space where you can both shoot and produce, and I know there'll be a lot of room for that. In terms of freelancing, again, specifically, we also have our vicenews.com, which I know takes freelance pitches, so yeah.
Amanda?
Yeah, for Reveal and the Center for Investigative Reporting, most of the story ideas, come from our team or from the newsroom. But the radio show is a really good way to get stories with us because they have a weekly investigative show, so they have a lot of time to fill, and half of their content comes from outside of our newsroom. And in fact, they have worked with filmmakers in the past. I think the film, Zach Stauffer was the director. I think it was here at Double Exposure last year about a very unsafe Navy helicopter and a whistleblower who ended up being killed on that helicopter. So he had done the film, but then he worked with our radio team, and they did an hour-long version for the podcast where they used some outtakes that never made the film. Some parts of the film, he and the reporter on it were the voices of it and narrated it. And then the third act of the radio show was actually a screening of the documentary with the characters and in that community. So the podcast was a way of organically kind of pushing the film forward and hearing a little bit more about what the impact of the film was. And I know that they're looking for more collaborations and stories like that. So that's definitely a big platform.
Hi, so my question is for Lindsay and Zach and anyone else who it might be relevant to, but I think specifically you guys. So for the docs that you do end up buying, what do you look for with the pitches? And yeah, for finished docs, what are you looking for?
That's a great question. The top answer to it is that I have no idea. It's literally something that I've never seen before, and that's really surprising to me, and therefore will hopefully be surprising to my audience. I think it's really important if you do pitch us to think, especially, often filmmakers will come to us and say, this is a really important topic, and they're right, it's a really important topic, and usually such an important topic that I've gotten 100 pitches on it, and that's great, and that's wonderful, and I really want to take them, but I can usually only take one. We publish about 40 films a year, and so I think it's important to think about when you're pitching us, why is yours special in a really serious way? Like, what's different about your film? Why is your film the one that's going to really change people's minds about this issue? And so that's really what I'm looking for, is that specific film. More broadly, I'm looking for films about beautiful, important films done with a really wide range of creative approaches and styles, done by diverse filmmakers. But that's a much more vague way of saying the first part.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question because we're open to a lot of different types of projects, but I would say, there's some really great highly personal documentary projects. That's probably not always going to be the best fit for us. We're looking, just frankly, for stories that are unique, but also that sort of fit into a bigger picture, an item in the news or of public interest. And I think, for the filmmaker, from the filmmaker, we're looking for flexibility and some openness to feedback, to getting it out to audiences in different ways, on different platforms that maybe they weren't at first thinking of, but they could be really valuable. And we're also looking for a diversity of perspectives and backgrounds in the filmmakers that we're looking for, who can bring us stories that we wouldn't be thinking about in the same way.
Hi, so I'm wondering for specifically the smaller newsrooms and or nonprofits, particularly working on like smaller budgets, how do you manage these really intimidating projects with like 2 to 4 people on your video team?
I can start. Yeah, we have 3 video journalists and a full-time editor, and then an executive producer. But how we've managed to do this is actually because all of us happen to be Swiss Army knives, which is very useful when you have a small team. Is we can be the crew on each other's team. So I may be in a producer role on one project, but I am serving as the cinematographer on another project. And that is kind of how we've managed to. So, or, I'll run audio while somebody else is doing the cinematography, so that we can build the relationships within our team so that we can be a really great team in the field together, and we have that kind of, shorthand that we don't have to figure out how to work with somebody when you're working in some really difficult situations. You want to have that kind of relationship with the people that you're working with in the field. And that's kind of how we've been able to do it. But Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes we're not available for each other, and you have to just go and be a one-man band, and that's not ideal, but we often have to do that.
I would say for us at CIR, it's on our shorter term pieces, it's a similar thing where everyone wears lots of hats and does that. For our longer term projects, I think the hardest thing for us has been getting development funding, to work on features and series. So like with the doc feature we're working on, that's being funded by impact partners and some other grants. In terms of getting into the longer form doc series, we just realized that we can fund the investigative reporting element, but it can take a lot to get those projects off the ground. So we've done that by partnering with larger organizations who have the budget to help us get to the stage so we can pitch it. So for instance, we're right now developing a project about police investigations of sexual assault and rape. And so we're partnering with Refinery 29 on that and their originals unit. So they were able to fund, we can bring the reporting and the IP and we collaborate 50-50 and they can pitch in to help us do some of the initial production to get enough on tape that then we can bring it to a distributor. So that's how we've bridged that on some of the longer form projects where we can't make that happen with our budgets.
And I was also going to say at Newsy, we're fortunate on the staffing side because we have some really talented folks in different roles in-house, but Newsy is quite an upstart company still, and it's a place that people so far have gone to for more of a daily news product. So for this sort of work, partnerships are hugely valuable to Amanda's point. So for In Dry Water, for example, the clip that we saw at the beginning, that's something that we literally just got a draft done in time to show it at DX here, and that's a project where we're currently looking for another news outlet to partner with on distribution. Finding the right partner to help sort of elevate the visibility of a project is one way we get around having some limitations as to the size of the company.
Hey, all this is a question for the group. I think one of the interesting challenges in working in this space is just the sheer volume of people that are creating content like this. And so I'm curious, as people that have to constantly innovate and experiment and come up with new types of storytelling methods, what are some memorable successes and failures when it comes to trying different types of storytelling formats that you guys have experienced?
For us, I would say something that's really successful usually is taking an important topic and maybe having a really, really insightful way that you're actually articulating the story. Like if you're a really great writer, the way that you're scripting what you're saying about it and your point of view is a really great way to make your thing stand out. And then also, if you're a really great animator or have access to that, to telling a story with amazing graphics, those kinds of opinion-driven pieces are really successful for us right now. Also, if you're more of a verite type of filmmaker and you've just captured really amazing footage, that alone will often sustain a great pitch for us. A failure would be often, especially because we are the New York Times and we do have a very robust print or written journalistic arm, telling us that this story appeared in the Times. I only say this because people do this a lot. That will backfire because what are you bringing to it that's different? You need to be able to answer that.
I will say that one thing that this is not a failure, but I think one way we found success is by interesting pairings within the newsroom, and Cassie was talking about this. I think everybody up here does this to an extent, but for example, we just published a video that was sort of a spinoff of the documentary, the feature I was talking about earlier, where it was really just two people working on it, a really great data reporter who's actually in the audience, and a really great animator who's also in the audience. And just like those two pairings, great data journalism and finely crafted visuals was a recipe for success, and having it stand out is a really cool product.
Collaboration is really the wave of the future, isn't it?
Yeah. I'll quickly just add, because I can't really speak for failures at my show at large. I'm not at the senior level and don't feel comfortable, so I really speak personally. But I think, I don't know if this answers your question, but I'm like kind of, because of my background in photography, I'm kind of like a classic storyteller, kind of like meat and potatoes. Like I love my verite and my scenes and being a fly on the wall. And I think for me, in terms of evolving the storytelling process, is kind of this challenge of being investigative by being visual, and that's really hard to accomplish, and why I choose topics like mental health. I like complicated stories. I get made fun of a lot in the pitch room when it's like, oh, here goes Cassie, another complicated story. Like, who's going to take that? Doesn't sound visual at all, but I like that challenge. If someone says it's not visual, I'm like, well, let me show you how. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of like a challenge I'm always posing myself, is how can you be investigative but still a photographer?